today is the topic of tariffs. I've been listening to some podcasts and reading a bit about tariffs, and I'm always curious about tariffs for a couple of reasons. One, how well do they work? Two, who ends up paying for them? Is it the consumer? And when I look at it in the electronics industry, and I think of tariffs as, maybe combating some of that potential dumping that we see from elsewhere. The third question that comes to my mind is, are we so addicted to low cost product that it's going to be really hard to shift mindsets? So let's start with, do tariffs work? From an economist point of view, what's your kind of overarching view on tariffs?
I think in some instances they can work. They rarely probably work to the full extent that you expect them to. So, it kind of nets out in the middle. It does obviously impact the market. And so I think if you look at tariffs, especially when it comes to the US, it might not necessarily mean that production moves to the US. But in the case of China, it certainly has meant, and if you step back to 2017 when Trump implemented a number of tariffs against Chinese goods, and then Biden, of course, kept these in place, and in some instances, as I noted, steel has ratcheted them up. uh, China has definitely lost market share in terms of imports coming into the US since 2017. And it's been pronounced in a number of electronics categories. So you see other countries benefiting, you see other countries in Southeast Asia benefiting. So, Malaysia, Vietnam, even Laos, Korea benefits, Japan benefits on the margin. Mexico ends up being a big beneficiary as well. So you start to see more goods flowing through Mexico. Now, in many instances, China might still be tied to that supply chain. They might
Mm,
be partners. We've seen China investing more in Mexico as a result of some of these tariffs. Regardless of who is president next year, I think these tariffs stay in place, and
yeah.
that shift will continue. Some of that shift can't happen right off the bat. So there is clearly a shift that has taken place, and I think there is still more shift to take place as sourcing relationships evolve and change. And I do think the U.S. benefits, but other countries, notably Mexico, also benefit significantly from some of these things.
Yeah. So when you look at a tariff and, for example, 100% tariff on Chinese EVs is a big headline. When you look at that tariff, do does some of the supply chain, does some of the Chinese supply chain absorb some of that cost to keep those products competitive? Is it all paid by consumer? And if it is all paid by consumer, does it bring us to a situation where a BYD is more expensive than a Tesla? So we buy a Tesla, so market share shifts, in which case it's probably been a successful tariff. Who ends up paying?
I think everyone ends up paying, and again, it depends a little bit on the individual market. I mean, I think the scenario you laid out is accurate, that if the company in China doesn't change a single thing and they just raise the price, then you do see an environment where the prices are higher for those Chinese imports. Um, Early in a tariff's life, you typically see Chinese companies trying to absorb it, not passing those costs on to consumers. Especially in the U.S., we know consumers are extremely price sensitive, and so they're not likely to pay more. And then over time, you do see the shift to other players, other markets, moving goods through other places. I mean, flat panel televisions is kind of a great example, where even a small tariff on flat panel televisions coming into the US pushed a tremendous amount of that supply to Mexico. So even today, many of the flat panel televisions that are being consumed in the US are being imported through Mexico. Now we know that the panels for those aren't being produced for the most part in
Yeah.
Mexico. So the parts and components are probably still coming largely from Asia, and there's enough happening in Mexico to qualify it for for tariff-free import into the US. And so I think that also happens. Now, Mexico benefits from that, and I think we'll see that. When it comes to EVs, uh, I think the supply chain from there is much more complex. If you take a non-EV vehicle, for example, it's not uncommon for pieces of it to be manufactured in Mexico, some of it to be manufactured in the US, and things to travel back and forth. I've
Yeah.
seen statistics that suggest, the car before it is finished has moved across the border 7 times
Wow.
to have a little bit done, and then a little bit done in the US, and a little bit more is done in
Yeah.
Mexico, and then it all comes together. And maybe it's all coming together in the US, maybe it's all coming together in Mexico, and so. The EV supply chain in North America has been, as I noted earlier, is being built around the more of the eastern states. So you're seeing a lot of that show up Texas has some, but you see it showing up in the Carolinas and Tennessee, and there's been a lot of investment in Georgia in this area. I mean, Georgia as a state has in the last 3 years hit record numbers of investment commitments. So there's a lot of companies investing in facilities in Georgia. And so I think, tariffs on EVs for North America will probably see some of that shift to figure out how to better incorporate what's happening in Mexico,
Yeah.
and Mexico will become a bigger player in that. Obviously, Mexico is already a very big player in the auto
Yeah.
industry. And it isn't just the US. We've seen EU also implement tariffs right now, provisional tariffs. So they're temporary, but we could see those become more permanent in the next 4 months. So Europe is a bigger EV market. I think it's noteworthy
Yeah.
that they're also trying to protect their domestic production. They don't want to see low-priced, inexpensive EVs flooded in those markets, even though they're arguably a much more progressive market when it comes to EVs than
Mm.
the US has. I mean, you've got a number of very big goals that they're trying to achieve in
Yeah.
many of the European countries. Some have, restricted where non-EV cars can drive. And so you've got a big push to have EVs. And, obviously the car culture is a little different in
Yeah.
Europe.
Yeah.
Uh,
And
taxes on cars are much higher in many places, but
I think it's interesting when you look at some of the European brands that they're trying to encourage more loyalty towards. You look to Scandinavia, you look at a company like Volvo and think, yeah, that's a Swedish brand, but it's owned by a Chinese company. So, it's complex. But when you look at it from a government point of view, Shawn, I guess all you've got is you've got tariffs and you've got subsidies. So when you look to protect something that may be strategically important and at critical mass, like the printed circuit board industry, those are the tools that you really have, short of insisting that certain products that are perhaps in the military or in aerospace have products that are made in the US. All you can do is apply a tariff or a subsidy.
yeah, and I think you see that happening in the EV market. Obviously is nascent in North America. It's a little more mature in Europe, but broadly the automotive industry is considered strategic in both of those markets. It's obviously an important market in Europe, and there's a great legacy of car manufacturers and vehicle
Mm.
manufacturers in Europe, and obviously the same is true in North America. And so, as a result, you've seen both of them, both those regions put tariffs on EVs. I think in support of their domestic production, but also in support of a nascent market trying to develop, because you really need, especially when it comes to EVs, you need the ecosystem to come
Yeah,
together in order for it to be successful. So I think that's some of what the EU and the US are trying to protect, is the development of that ecosystem to get all
yeah,
all players together. And you have seen great announcements. You've seen a number of foreign companies announce EV related projects in the US where they're going to build plants, they're going to build batteries have been a big one, but also
yeah.
EV chargers and other things being built in in that market to support that market. So
yeah, and I think that trend towards regionalization is a good thing in terms of sustainability and in terms of long-term security of supply chain. So I think that all makes sense. Last question on tariffs and last question before we wrap up. Do you think, you talked about the US being perhaps more price sensitive than other markets, and I kind of feel that that is the case in many instances. Do you think we've got to shift our addiction to low cost products to really create this correction in the supply chain? Or do you think we can do enough in terms of automation and process development to become competitive with
so
those global markets?
I actually think both are happening. I think if you look at the younger generation, they are willing, and now this could change as they age, as they mature. But when it comes to jobs, they're inclined to take a job, and they want a job where the organization that they're working for is aligned with their own social views and their own social values. And in many instances, this, Gen Z is willing to take lower pay in order to work for a company that aligns with their social values. And so I think the same is true, that they're willing, if they think it's important to support a domestic economy, then I think they might be willing to, to pay higher prices or to sacrifice in other ways. So some of that might happen.
Mm.
Now, we'll have to wait and see as this, as this audience matures and as that segment becomes a bigger segment of the buying population, if that really happens. And at the same time, Chinese industrial infrastructure, their manufacturing capabilities and capacity are aging, and so
Mm.
they are becoming less efficient than new capital that's being deployed. And if you think of all the new factories that are coming into to North America, those will be and should be the most efficient, most productive factories in the world. And the same is
Yeah,
true, obviously, for new factories that show up in Europe or anywhere else in Asia. These
yeah,
should be highly automated. I think they will be, if not highly automated, they will have a significant influence from technology. Technology will play a much more significant role, and so you will see, productivity and other enhancements, efficiency gains from that. And so
yeah,
there could be a narrative there where the cost delta isn't as significant as it might have been, especially if you're not considering, the upfront capital costs of that. And then, you've got again, just going back to my earlier comment, the level of sophistication of some of these technologies are going to
yeah.
require some level of automation, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting. You reduce the delta in terms of the price, and you have a generation with a different sentiment towards how their products are made and where they buy, and if those two come together, you end up with a purchasing pattern that reflects a more regional manufacturing pattern, which I actually think in the long term is good for everybody. It raises living standards in all of the places that manufacturing has done, and it creates good sustainable jobs in those regions as well, and it's good for those markets. So fascinating stuff as always, Shawn. Thanks so much for your time. Let's get this as a monthly cadence so we can dig into the sentiments and the numbers that you're seeing, but also touch on some of these topics that for a non-economist like myself leave me scratching my head, and we can dig into your expertise. Thanks so much for your time.
Yep. See you soon.